This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 197 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the Numberfire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I went to Twitter on Sunday, and I asked if people wanted me to focus more on adds and drops on this show instead of buys and sells. And the reason was because I would assume almost all trade deadlines have passed, so buys and sells are less meaningful. And the majority of people did say yes. They wanted just add and drop information. I do think buy and sell transactions can still be helpful for people because it gives you an idea of how confident to be in particular players. But after thinking about it, I realized that a buy or sell transaction only helps a small number of people. Like if I tell you to go buy Brandon Cooks, you obviously can't trade for him. So I'm really just helping the less than 10% of you who have Brandon Cooks. And by the way, Brandon Cooks has positive touchdown regression coming. But this week's podcast and the two more 15 transaction ones that I'll do through the end of the fantasy season will focus solely on adds, drops, and holds. Guys you should get off your waiver wire, put on your waiver wire, and wait to send to your waiver wire. Hopefully it all helps you guys bring home a fantasy football championship. Now let's dig in. Add Jalen Samuels and Stephen Ridley. James Conner left Sunday night's game against the Chargers with a lower leg contusion, and that allowed Jalen Samuels to be in a more featured role. He played a quarter of Pittsburgh's snaps, and he was the clear backup to James Conner. But I do think we have to keep in mind that the Steelers were playing from behind when all this happened. When James Conner went down, they were trailing. And Samuels is a pass-catching back who played sort of a hybrid role at North Carolina State. He actually never carried the ball more than 78 times in a single season at NC State. And I think that's important because while Samuels is a clear top priority off the waiver wire this week if Conner does indeed miss time, and that's especially true considering he's tight end eligible on some fantasy sites, don't forget about Stephen Ridley. Stephen Ridley's the more traditional bruiser in that backfield between the two guys. And in a November article on Steelers.com, it was noted that head coach Mike Tomlin views Pittsburgh backup running backs as two guys with, quote, distinct skill sets. And then when asked about Conner's true backup, Tomlin said, it depends on circumstance. So while everyone's adding Jalen Samuels, and they should be adding Jalen Samuels, don't forget about Stephen Ridley this week. There's a chance that this is more of a split backfield if Conner does indeed miss a game. But there is good news because it sounds like the injury might not be a major one. Add Justin Jackson. So with Melvin Gordon sidelined, we were all ready for the Austin Eckler show. And then Justin Jackson kind of stole it on Sunday night. Jackson only played 22.2% of LA's snaps on Sunday, but he was the more effective back on the ground. I think that we can say that objectively. He ran the ball 8 times for 63 yards in the score, whereas Austin Eckler had 13 carries for just 21 yards. So I think that logic would sort of tell us that Justin Jackson should see an uptick in volume here in week 14. That's obviously as long as Melvin Gordon is still sidelined. So I would get him off the waiver wire this week if you need a flex type player. And the Chargers get the Bengals, giving Jackson a plus matchup. Drop Carlos Hyde. You should absolutely be rostering handcuffs this time of year. I've been talking about that for weeks. But the problem with Carlos Hyde is that he's not even Leonard Fournette's handcuff. With Fournette out this past Sunday, Hyde played fewer than 40% of Jacksonville's snaps. TJ Yeldon saw way more snaps than Carlos Hyde did. And he saw a bigger workload when you combine rushing and receiving. And remember, that all happened with the Jags in a neutral to positive game script. It was the perfect kind of game for Carlos Hyde to see a pretty big workload. So even if Leonard Fournette gets injured in the fantasy playoffs, and hopefully that doesn't happen, but even if he does, it would be tough to trust Carlos Hyde in your fantasy lineup. So because of that, you can let him go. Add Jeff Wilson. Matt Breida's body has just been completely destroyed in 2018. He's hurt all the time, and he always seems to play. But on Sunday, he aggravated his ankle injury during pregame warmups, and that allowed Jeff Wilson to carry the ball 15 times on over 72% of the 49ers snaps. And Wilson also did some work as a receiver, catching 8 of 9 targets for 73 yards. Breida's now already been ruled out for week 14, and I think Jeff Wilson could end up being a decent play. You know, as poor as San Francisco's been offensively at times this year, they're a top 10 fantasy football team in running back scoring. It's not that bad of a situation fantasy-wise. Add Dante Pettis. Pettis now has 20 targets over his last 3 games. That easily leads the 49ers. And over his last 2, he's played at least 90% of the team snaps in each game. and they're moving him all over the field. According to Pro Football Focus, he's played 44.5% of his snaps from the slot during this time, and he's been really productive. He's hauled in over 200 yards and 3 touchdowns across his last 3 games. The schedule for San Francisco isn't that amazing moving forward, but he could be an interesting play in deeper leagues this week against a Chris Harris-less Denver Broncos secondary, as long as Marquise Goodwin and Pierre Garçon remain sidelined. Hold Allen Robinson. From a production standpoint, Robinson hasn't been that great across the last 3 weeks. He's seen a solid 20 targets, but he's combined for 155 yards and no touchdowns. That's not really what you're looking for from a fantasy perspective. But there are 2 things that should make you feel good about Allen Robinson. First, Mitch Trubisky is likely to return in Week 14, so that'll give a boost to the Bears' passing attack. But in Weeks 14 through 16, Chicago will face the Rams, Packers, and 49ers. Those are 3 teams who rank in the top 7 in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers this year. At the very least, there's a good chance for a fairly pass-heavy approach from Chicago, which will help Allen Robinson's volume, and that'll make him relevant in fantasy football. So if you're thinking about dropping him, don't do it just yet. Add Rex Burkhead. Burkhead returned to action in Week 13. He was sidelined for a lot of the season, and he found the field on 23% of New England's offensive snaps. Now, that's not all that great, and he probably won't be more than a desperation flex for most teams without an injury, but he still serves as a handcuff to not just one running back, but 2 running backs. If Sony Michel or James White go down, then Rex Burkhead will definitely see more work in that backfield. And it's a backfield that scored top 5 fantasy numbers across the league this year. Add Bruce Ellington. I keep talking about Bruce Ellington week over week, but his ownership numbers haven't really budged all that much since Golden Tate left the team. And it's kind of weird because he's now seen 9, 7, and 10 targets over the Lions' last 3 games. That's a 24.1% target share. But the problem is that a lot of his targets have not been very good. He has a really, really low average depth of target. He's actually not had a single target of 15 or more air yards during this time. But I do think in PPR formats, his workload is strong enough to warrant an ad off the waiver wire. Drop Jacksonville Jaguars wide receivers. So as it stands, Dede Westbrook is rostered in 35% of Yahoo leagues, Dante Moncrief is at 16%, and Keelan Cole is at 13%. Those numbers should be far closer to 0. Westbrook and Moncrief have posted just 1 top 20 performance since Week 4, and Keelan Cole hasn't been relevant for weeks. With Cody Kessler under center, there's not that much upside in this passing offense. There's really no reason to have these 3 wide receivers on your roster. They're just not going to give you predictable output. Add Charcandrick West and Damian Williams. So with Kareem Hunt no longer on the Chiefs, Spencer Ware saw the largest workload for Kansas City in Week 13. That was expected, but it wasn't as significant as what we might have thought. He handled 46.7% of the Chiefs' rushes when Kareem Hunt had a 68% share when he was active this season. Ware was on the field for 69% of their snaps. Meanwhile, Kareem Hunt hit that low of a snap rate in just 4 contests this year. Damian Williams was one player who dug into Ware's volume. He carried the ball 5 times and he saw 2 targets. And then on Monday, the Chiefs signed Charcandrick West. Remember him? That just adds to the backfield potentially becoming really messy. But by rostering Williams or West, or maybe even both, you're taking a chance on a player who could emerge in a very, very useful offense. It's not like Ware has been all that special this year. He finished Week 13 with just a 16.7% success rate. That's horrible. And his success rate on the season is 29.4%. That's also horrible. Unfortunately, though, the backfield is probably going to be pretty split through the end of the fantasy season. And I do think that Ware is still the guy that you want to have. But there's always a chance that the Chiefs like what they see from either Williams or West, which would lead to more work and fantasy relevancy for one of those running backs. Add Ian Thomas. So Greg Olsen is now out for the year with another foot injury, and Ian Thomas is the guy who's going to step up for Carolina at tight end in his absence. Thomas saw 5 targets in Carolina's Week 13 loss to Tampa Bay, and he had a pair of games with 5+ targets just before Olsen returned from injury earlier this season. I mean, Thomas isn't anything more than a streaming type option, but the Panthers do have an attractive schedule from here on out. That's something I've talked about a lot on the show over the last 5 or so weeks. They're going to go up against the Browns, Saints, and Falcons through Week 16. So he's a very easy way to get a piece of this passing attack. Drop Matthew Stafford. The last time Matthew Stafford gave fantasy teams a top 12 QB1 performance was all the way back in Week 2 against San Francisco. Since then, he's averaging fewer than 14 fantasy points per game, and he's yet to have a game with more than 2 touchdown passes. And somehow, some way, I have no idea how or why, he's still rostered in 2/3 of Yahoo leagues. With below average matchups against the Cardinals, Bills, and Vikings in the fantasy playoffs, it's hard to imagine a scenario outside of maybe a super flex league or a 2-quarterback league where you're starting Matthew Stafford for the championship. You can send him to the waiver wire. Add Josh Allen. Look, it's really easy to criticize Josh Allen for his inaccuracy and his tendency to turn the ball over. I was one of those people who didn't like Josh Allen entering the league. But he's also working with a bad offensive line and arguably the weakest set of wide receivers in the entire NFL. I actually think that Josh Allen has played pretty well when you give his situation some context. But this is a fantasy football show. Let's talk about fantasy football. He's been huge from a fantasy perspective, and it's all thanks to his legs. This past Sunday against Miami, he ran for 135 yards on the ground. 135. He had 99 rushing yards the previous week. Now, these aren't the type of yards that you're going to see from someone like Lamar Jackson, but when a quarterback's under pressure all the time, like Josh Allen is, he's bound to scramble. And Josh Allen is athletic, so when he scrambles, he's able to pick up yards. That should put him on your fantasy radar, especially here in Week 14. He's finished as a top 5 option in each of his last 2 games, and with a matchup against a Jets secondary that's given up 17 or more fantasy points to an opposing quarterback in 8 of their last 9 games, there's a little bit upside with his arm this week. So when you have that combined with his rushing ability, he's actually a pretty decent option in Week 14. Add the Arizona Cardinals defense. The Cardinals are at home against the Lions this week in a game with a low 41-point over-under. And the Lions have been low-key awesome for opposing defenses, at least across the last half of the season. Over their last 6 games, 4 have resulted in a top 5 weekly performance from an opposing defense. So it is a really good spot for the Cardinals as more of a traditional defensive streamer this week. Add the Buffalo Bills defense. I was kind of shocked to see that Buffalo was still available in 70% of Yahoo leagues. And it's because they were a decent enough option this past week in Week 13, and they've got a really nice Week 14 and Week 15 schedule. Over the next 2 weeks, the Bills will be playing at home against the Jets, and then at home against the aforementioned Lions. I already talked about how the Lions are a good matchup, but the Jets have also been really, really good as well, with teams averaging almost 3 sacks and 2 interceptions per game against them over their last 4 contests. The 16th transaction that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column on NumberFire is to add the Atlanta Falcons defense. You might be wondering, why would I add the Falcons when they're playing on the road this week against Green Bay? Well, it's not for this week, it's for next week. In Week 15, there's not a whole lot of obvious streaming defenses, but I don't totally mind Atlanta at home against Arizona. The Cardinals were pretty good against the Packers this past weekend, but they entered the week having allowed a top 8 finish to an opposing defense in 5 of their previous 6 games while giving up 3.5 sacks per contest. Now, Atlanta's not very good defensively, I get it, but they're at home and they'll likely be pretty decent favorites. So hopefully you planned ahead, but if not, they're one team that no one will be looking to add. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And as always, if you're on iTunes, please leave me a rating and review. And I'm also on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.